Thank you very much. And yeah, thanks very much for having me. It's a privilege to be here. I haven't avoided for 3 years. It was COVID, and then I've had 2 babies. One was actually on the day of the conference last October. So I'm very pleased to be here, but probably a little bit more rusty than I would have been if you'd had me 3 years ago. So be patient. I'll try not to sing any nursery rhymes. So today I'm going to be talking about nutrition to optimise rehabilitation from injury. So I suppose I should start off by saying that there isn't very much research. It's clearly limited by its design. If ethics committees were happy for us to injure athletes to then investigate optimal strategies for recovery, that would be great in one regard, but clearly that is never going to happen. So the research is a little bit limited. And the difficulty is that the stakes are so high in elite sport. From the athlete's perspective, they obviously want to get back to performance as quickly as possible, but also external factors like coaches and management, there might be a lot of money at stake. So the pressure's high, and the pressure's really felt by the practitioners and the multidisciplinary team to get those athletes back ASAP. So what we tend to do is, if there's a sound theory, then we're probably going to give it a go as long as it doesn't cause any harm. So that's kind of the opening caveat to this presentation. So I'll be focusing on the most common running-related injuries, so bone, muscle, and then tendon and ligament. Obviously lots of practical nutrition advice along the way, and then a few extra considerations from having worked kind of in the trenches with athletes over the last 10 years. So starting off with bone health then. So bone injuries tend to come in 2 types. We have the stress injuries and then the bone breakages. With the stress fractures or stress injuries we have, they're most commonly in athletes that are putting load continually through their bone. So you guys, marathon runners, ultra endurance runners, and those type of events. Whereas the bone breakages, they're more likely to come off the back of like a catastrophic accident or some kind of collision. So maybe more like team sports, rugby, skiing, those kind of events. The athletes that are going to be at the highest risk of injuries then are athletes that are overloaded. So again, our endurance athletes, our runners, middle distance, long distance, marathoners, ultra endurance. And then also our offloaded athletes. And this is kind of in 2 parts. One, those guys are generally more likely to have the catastrophic events, so falling off a bike perhaps, but also the predominant part of their training is offloaded the bone. So actually in these groups of population, these athletes, we tend to see much poorer bone mineral density. So their bones are weaker, and then they're exposed to these collisions, so the bone breakages are more common in this population. In terms of the micronutrients involved in bone, pretty much every micronutrient is going to be important in bone metabolism. Obviously, calcium is at the forefront of that. I'm not going to go into the details, but pretty much every micronutrient is going to be important. When it comes to analysing bone health, we have 2 ways of doing that. We have the direct marker, so I'm sure you guys are familiar with DEXA. DEXA is a lovely tool for nutritionists to be able to use in the field. It's expensive, so it's not always available. But if you can get hold of DEXA scans for your athletes, really, really nice insight into not just bone mineral density, which is obviously segmented, so you can really look at what areas might be deficient within your athletes, but also for looking at muscular imbalances. And particularly during rehab, this is really, really beneficial. And then we have the indirect markers, which is much more where nutrition kind of comes to the front. So obviously nutrition playing a role here in very low body fat levels and very low energy intakes, amenorrhea, obviously a result potentially of overtraining and underfueling, and vitamin D status. So you can see how nutrition is playing a really important role in these indirect markers of bone health. And I'll just share with you this study where you can see quite clearly here when energy intake was severely insufficient, so just 10 calories per kilogram of lean body mass per day, bone formation markers were significantly blunted, and bone breakdown was much higher compared with those that were having energy intakes that much better matched their energy expenditure. And I just wanted to share this study with you too, because I think when people think about recovery nutrition, you kind of just think about muscle. And everybody knows you should have a carbohydrate and a protein shake after your exercise, or at least you should have a meal with carbohydrate and protein in it, because that's going to help your muscles recover. But this was the first study that looked at the impact of that kind of recovery on bone metabolism. It was a really nice study where they provided either a placebo or a carbohydrate and protein beverage either immediately after running to exhaustion or 2 hours post, and then they looked at bone formation and bone breakdown markers. And what they found was that the combination of carbohydrate and protein given immediately after exercise, so this was running to exhaustion, had a significant improvement in bone turnover, so increase in bone formation and a reduction in bone breakdown. And that was obviously compared to placebo, but also compared to the 2-hour delay. So next time you go for that post-running recovery drink or meal, you can be thinking about it helping your bones as well as your muscles, which is great. So on to some of the more applied perspective then. So I think it's really important to think proactively about injuries, and actually injuries is something we choose not to think about. But actually when I'm working with a large group of athletes, I really like to have these proactive strategies in place. So identifying first and foremost who is going to be at greatest risk of getting a bone injury. So is that our female athletes that are overloaded and amenorrheic? We can determine from the kind of sports which might put athletes at higher risk. Also identifying the highest time of year for the greatest risk. So is that going to be pre-season when the mileage really starts to ramp up, or is it going to be pre-race? So if you're training for a marathon, when the miles start to go up and up, is that when they're at the highest risk as well? And during those times, it's really important to increase the intake of the key nutrients that we know are going to be important for bone health, and also to think carefully about the timing. So we know, for example, that calcium intake pre-exercise is going to be really helpful for any bone loading activity, because the bone's much more likely to be able to absorb and use those nutrients in bone metabolism if it's in the bloodstream prior to exercise. And I just presented a study which showed that immediate intake of carbohydrate and protein was helpful too. So proactively, I'd start to think about these kind of things. So micronutrient loading pre, and high energy availability generally around those key training sessions. Just some foodie examples, because what kind of nutritionist would I be if I didn't put a picture of food up here? So obviously milk, great source of calcium, great source of protein, a little bit of sugar in there too. Nut butters like almond have got some calcium in them too. Fortified cereals, again, porridge, great. I bet most of the people here are having porridge before running tomorrow. If any of you are doing that, it's a great choice. You've got calcium in the milk, you've got some good protein in there too. Nuts and seeds, another great source of calcium. And then your kind of greens, so kale, great source of calcium too. Sardines would be perfect, but I'm yet to meet an athlete that would choose to have that before running, maybe one day. So that's the proactive, and then as and when that injury comes along, then the reactive strategy is quite straightforward. So consuming plenty of protein, ideally dairy protein at regular intervals throughout the day, at least 3 portions of dairy. Calcium-rich diet from lots of sources is going to be really beneficial too. We know that having that post-exercise protein and carbohydrate nutrition is going to be really helpful for bone metabolism too. Also consuming a micronutrient and antioxidant-dense diet, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but pretty much every micronutrient is going to be helpful for bone metabolism. And then, if possible, tracking bone health, particularly if you're working with elite athletes, tracking bone health so we can have a little bit of insight into what might come. And then if we have an injury, then monitoring body mass, body composition with DEXA can be really valuable to make sure you don't end up with really large imbalances in muscle mass. So moving swiftly on to muscle injury, I've chosen 4 potential areas of impact that nutrition can have based on the research that's available. So increasing muscle protein synthesis is obviously going to be really, really important following a muscle injury. And then modulating the inflammatory response is really important as well. Obviously antioxidants, balancing that oxidative stress, and also preserving the cell membrane integrity. So if we're thinking about the kind of nutrition that fits into these, this is kind of a no-brainer. So we know dairy protein's really helpful. There's been lots of studies using protein powder, so whey powder generally is the formation of most of the studies. Branched-chain amino acids, creatine for helping preserve muscle mass, and vitamin D. These tend to be the key nutrients that people are thinking about when it comes to rehab from muscle injuries. Anti-inflammatory, there's been some really lovely research over the last 5-10 years with omega-3 or fish oil supplementation, and the vast benefits that that can have when rehabbing, particularly for muscle. So obviously helping that inflammatory response. I'll come on to the specific strategies later, helping with muscle protein synthesis, and also in preserving the cell membrane within that muscle. And then antioxidants and anti-inflammatories, the research the field of research has been absolutely flooded with research into antioxidants and anti-inflammatories from food, from nutrition, over the last probably 5 to 10 years as well, which is great because food first is always the best practice in most nutritionists' opinion. So berries, cherries, beetroot are very well researched now, and there's really good science to suggest that natural antioxidants can have a really beneficial effect on muscle health and muscle recovery. Again, blueberries, pomegranate have also been quite well researched. And then, of course, we have the pharmaceutically prepared antioxidants like vitamin C and vitamin E, which have to be much more carefully managed because obviously they're a lot more potent when it comes to the impact on redox balance. I'm just going to use this opportunity to talk about a special interest of mine as well, which is magnesium. If any of you have heard me talk before, I do love to talk about magnesium. Whilst I was at British Athletics, I started to notice there was a quite high prevalence of deficiency in magnesium, which is something I hadn't really come across before in other athlete populations. I'm not entirely sure why this was the case, maybe because high fibre diets inhibit absorption. We do know that plasma magnesium falls off transiently post-exercise before returning, presumably because that's being taken up into the muscles. So repeated exercise, repeated transient fluctuations may be causing chronic deficiencies. Do athletes need more magnesium? That is a question that is yet to be answered. And also, where's the magnesium going? Again, it's just a bit under-researched. Is it lost in the urine or in the sweat? So it became a bit of a side passion of mine. And we ended up going on a rather large journey to really dive into what was happening within our population of Olympic and Paralympic track and field athletes and published this paper. So we had just over 500 samples from nearly 200 of our Olympic and Paralympic athletes, and we collected red cell magnesium over an 8-year period. What we were really interested in was analysing to see if there were any correlations between those that were insufficient, so based on gender, ethnicity, athletic discipline, but also, and what's particularly relevant today, is whether any correlations with any injuries. So we looked at muscle injury, so the number of the number of injuries that athletes suffered that year, tendon pain, which was diagnosed by a chronic pain lasting more than 3 months, and bone injuries. So we found quite a high prevalence of deficiency in the athletes that were tested, and this was the average red cell across the population. So on average, there was 22% deficiency in magnesium. Having published this and spoken about it within other practitioner populations, actually not many people do analyse for magnesium, and when they do, they're not necessarily analysing it in the right way. So I mentioned plasma magnesium fluctuates, so you can't really measure that as an indicator of magnesium status, and you need to measure red cell magnesium, and that's really, really important. So hopefully more people are starting to do that. So we found 22% deficiency across the board. Magnesium was significantly lower in our female athletes and also in our black and mixed race ethnicity athletes, which is also where we tend to see vitamin D deficiency as well. And obviously magnesium and vitamin D go hand in hand in many of the metabolic processes. So that was interesting. A couple of random side points. We found that magnesium intake was higher in our throws athletes, probably because they just eat more, generally, but also high in our Paralympians with cerebral palsy, which is an interesting finding that we cannot explain at this point. But what's of particular interest, we found that athletes that had a history of Achilles and or patella tendon pain had significantly lower red cell magnesium than average. And this was an interesting finding because magnesium is an antagonist of the NMDA receptor, which is involved in the propagation of pain. So we strongly believe that any magnesium deficiencies really ought to be corrected because this can have an impact on tendon pain and tendon health. We also found that every muscle injury was associated with lower red cell magnesium. But we didn't find any correlations with bone. And I think this was probably because in our cohort we actually had relatively low bone injuries. So I think that probably needs investigating a little bit further. So translating this into practice, again, identifying those that are going to be at the highest risk. So these are going to be athletes that have a high load, particularly through the tendons in track and field and running. That's going to be the patella and the Achilles tendon. So histories of injuries there are going to predispose athletes to have repeated injuries. Highest risk times of year. This was a really interesting one for us actually at British Athletics. We found that lots of our sprint athletes would get Achilles issues in January when we go on our warm weather training camp. So the weather was nice, they were running fast, it was the first time properly running hard in spikes, and we used to go to a camp that had a really hard track, and almost all of our athletes would have tendon issues. So we worked really hard on multidisciplinary proactive approach for that and actually found that to be really beneficial. Again, increasing the intake of key nutrients, I'll come on to those, and the timing of those nutrients is really important. So the nutrition interventions, again, diets really rich in antioxidants and anti-inflammatories can be really beneficial. Regular hits of protein throughout the day for helping that recovery, and assessing magnesium and vitamin D status throughout the year and correcting that if there are any deficiencies there. And then, as and when the injury comes along, the advice would be to consume protein regularly throughout the day, including pre-bed. Lots of athletes forget to do that, and I think that's such a quick win. Ideally, dairy protein, because of the combination of whey and casein, can be really beneficial to have before bedtime. Choosing protein that has got high leucine content is really beneficial too. I've just realised I've been talking a bit about tendons, so apologies for that. Consider the high-dose antioxidant supplementation. Creatine can be really beneficial for rehab as well in preserving muscle mass, dosing quite high for a short period of time before lowering that down. Managing energy balance is really, really important too, and I will talk about that towards the end of the presentation. Tracking changes with DEXA is also important if that's possible, because that really integrates within the multidisciplinary team. I found that the physiotherapists and strength conditioning coaches actually find that data really valuable when working on conditioning certain sides of the body, particularly if there's been immobilization. And then I hate the saying, eat the rainbow, but it is so true. Eating a colourful diet makes sure that you have all those wide range of micronutrients that are going to have a really beneficial effect on the rehabilitation. So now moving on to tendon and ligament health. Ankle sprains are amongst the top 5 common running injuries. I'm guessing that comes as no surprise. I'd actually probably put money on that everyone in the room has sprained their ankle at some point, running or not. Males are more likely to have an Achilles tendinopathy. And there's some really exciting new findings that some of you may be aware of that have come out in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, looking at the impact of gelatin or collagen on tendon and ligament health. So I'm going to share that with you today, because I remember when I learned about this study, and it was just so exciting and novel and so practical. So much of the nutrition research is either theoretical or really difficult to apply from a food perspective. But when this study came along, it was really, really exciting. So this is from Keith Barr's lab, and it was the first to look at, in humans, the impact that gelatin or collagen can have on tendon and ligament health and rehabilitation. So a little snapshot then. For those of you that haven't seen this study, basically feeding collagen 1 hour prior to exercise. And 1 hour pre is very, very important, because that gives enough time for the amino acid profile to break down, and for proline, which is the important amino acid for this metabolism to happen, for enough for that to peak in the bloodstream. So 1 hour before, they did 6 minutes skipping. They did this 3 times a day for 3 days, and then looked at collagen formation markers at the end of this trial. And as I said, it was the first to show that having gelatin or collagen, so gelatin is just a really rich source of collagen, and it's a food substance, so we tend to talk about gelatin, in combination with vitamin C, and that's important because it helps the absorption, combined with an intermittent exercise program, had a significant effect on collagen synthesis, so therefore the impact that it can have on injury, repair, and general tendon and ligament health is really beneficial. So this is something that I would always talk to athletes about and really encourage to integrate this into a rehabilitation program. So then coming on to the practical advice again, same stands, the proactive, identifying those at the highest risk, the hardest times of year, even kind of on the smaller scale, even within the week, when are going to be the sessions that are most likely to load? So plyometrics, for example, those that are really putting the strain through tendons and ligaments. We don't know a huge amount about the menstrual cycle and how that impacts ligament laxity in females, but we do know there is something there. So potentially using these kind of interventions around certain times of the menstrual cycle could be beneficial for reducing the chance of injury as well. Again, antioxidants and anti-inflammatories can have a really beneficial effect when there's injuries, but also in just balancing that oxidative stress that's caused by the micro tears and the strains that are repeatedly going through tendons and ligaments. Collagen supplementation before the important sessions could be really valuable. And again, supplementing with magnesium if there's a deficiency is something I would strongly recommend. So when that injury comes along, again, the reactive plan would be to consume protein throughout the day. This is simple stuff, but it's often the stuff that just people forget about. They're so caught up in the injury, particularly high-profile athletes. There's media, they just go into a hole. They don't want to speak to any practitioners, and the basics just get forgotten, and the basics can have such a huge impact. So choosing proteins with a high leucine content, regular protein throughout the day, short courses of really high-dose omega-3, so kind of 5 grams upwards of omega-3 for maybe a week to 10 days to really help with that inflammation. Consider high-dose antioxidant supplementation, ideally through food types of supplements. So not just eating blueberries, but maybe the kind of really rich blueberry tablets, those kind of equivalent antioxidant supplements. Collagen supplementation, again, managing energy balance, measuring with DEXA, eating the rainbow. And then jelly. So jelly, also obviously a great source of gelatin. Quite a nice pre-training snack for athletes. Remember to take it 1 hour pre-training. The problem is the athlete may or may not want the calories that come with that, so I will share with you my tried and tested collagen jelly recipe. Feel free to have a go at making this. They're not bad taste-wise. So we would tend to proactively give athletes these before key training sessions. So less so in track and field. I've also worked 5 seasons in Premier League football where we actually would cater for the athletes. They would eat in the training facility, and this is the kind of food that would be put out prior to tough training sessions and matches, where we can actually provide for them. In track and field, the athletes are much more self-sufficient, so they would be given these kind of recipes to make their own. I said I'd touch on energy expenditure, and this is so important in rehab, and I think it gets a little bit overlooked. And I keep banging on about the basics, and this is probably one of the most basics and important things to be getting right. So if we think about rehab in 2 phases, we tend to have a phase of immobilization following an injury, and then we have the rehabilitation. And it'd be very easy to assume that during immobilization, energy expenditure would be reduced. And then during rehabilitation, energy expenditure would either go back up to where it was before, or potentially even higher if it's an aggressive rehab plan with gym and therapy. But actually, we really need to think carefully about that assumption. Because what we do know is that there's an increase in basal metabolic rate around 20% following large surgery, up to 50% following wound, infection or traumatic injury, and burns injuries can be increasing metabolic rate by 100%. So think cyclists with road burns, that actually is going to have a massive impact on their energy needs. Crutches, which are quite commonly used following an accident, can increase energy expenditure by 2 to 3-fold, so a massive increase in energy requirements needed if athletes are using crutches. So this is important because what we also know is that muscle protein synthesis is blunted by up to around 30% if there's even a small energy imbalance. So what a lot of athletes tend to do is they become injured, they switch off from nutrition because they haven't got the headspace to deal with it, but the only thing that they can think of is that they don't want to put on body fat. So they significantly cut down on their energy intake, and that can really, really blunt their rehab. So it's really important as a practitioner working with athletes that we really try and get hot on trying as best as possible to match their energy intake and their energy expenditure, which is not easy, but it's definitely worth a consideration. Of course, if they sit around moping about and consume too much, that's also detrimental. It can increase inflammation and can also hamper their body composition. So it's a very hard tightrope to walk, but it's a really, really important one. And then finally, I just want to share with you a simple concept that really helped me whilst I was at British Athletics. So I was responsible for just over 120 Olympic and Paralympic athletes on my own, which is a huge amount of athletes to work with. And obviously, many of them would get injured day by day, and it could easily slip through the net. And I'm very passionate about nutrition having a really big impact in the really early onset of an injury. So putting together these first response nutrition packs was something that I found really helpful. So I just put together these kind of generic packs for injuries, tendinopathies, muscle recovery, muscle and tendon injuries, bone health, Achilles support. So this was the example I gave from the warm weather training camp, and wound healing, so post-surgery or with our wheelchair racers that would get pressure sores. This would be helpful. And what this enabled us to do was that when they would get the diagnosis from the doctor could hand them this first response nutrition pack, so they would immediately know what they needed to do, and then that would buy me, say, 24 hours, 48 hours to then get in touch with the athlete, work on that plan, make it much more bespoke to them, their injuries, their preferences, their discipline. But what it did was just get in there quickly with that omega-3, the anti-inflammatories, antioxidants, the collagen, whatever it was that was needed. And I found that to work really, really well when working with such a large population of athletes. A few other considerations that worked well, which I would recommend, would be monitoring bloods throughout the season, picking up on any deficiencies that might predispose athletes to higher chances of getting an injury. So obviously vitamin D will be very important for bone health. Obviously I love magnesium, so I would recommend analysing red cell magnesium. But whatever your budget can allow, making sure that your athletes are sufficient in a wide range of important nutrients would be really beneficial. If possible, tracking body composition, so really understanding the bone health of that athlete can be really insightful, particularly if an athlete's not hugely forthcoming about the amount of food that they eat or whether they have a normal menstrual cycle. A bone scan can go straight to the crux of their bone health, and also monitoring body composition so that we know where we need to get back to post-injury. And then take the time to actually analyse the data. Sometimes it's just so easy to collect data and not take the time to make sense of it, and we are all guilty of that. But it's the analysis of that data that really leapfrogs us forward into our understanding. So looking wider, which athletes have disordered eating, maybe menstrual health infrequencies, those that are going to be more susceptible to overtraining or overtraining syndrome, and those that might have immune dysfunction. And I won't talk about that because Neil is up next. But we know that nutrition can play a really important role there. So to finish up then, research is limited by design, but the pressure is on. From the athlete's perspective, from the practitioners, from the whole team environment, an injury is not good. Pressure is on to get that athlete back as quickly as possible. There must be a sound scientific theory, a theory at least, not a publication, but there must be a theory that is sound that can give us an idea of where we could focus. But first of all, of course, we mustn't cause any additional harm. I truly believe that just getting the basics right can have a massive impact, and neglecting those basics can extend the rehab process by months. And the energy availability and specific nutrient availability, of which I've talked through, are really at the kind of crux or the centre of injury rehabilitation. So thank you very much, and if anyone's running tomorrow, good luck.